Good Tuesday morning, Dog Nation. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Deemer Box. It is a busy show coming up. Hopefully you'll find it to be a fun show. Obviously, some of the fun involves Jeff Sintel today as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. Some pretty interesting twists with the 2020 recruiting class. Jeff will give us the latest on that in terms of some guys who may be visiting Georgia, some Georgia targets who may be visiting elsewhere. We'll try to touch all those bases with him. Obviously, Georgia's trying to turn the page, looking ahead to Kentucky. Pretty outspoken moment yesterday from Georgia running back DeAndre Swift. We'll share some of that with you on today's program. And Kirby Smart trying to pick up the pieces and figure out what's wrong with the Georgia offense, as you might imagine. We'll start our program with that today, and maybe possibly a hopeful tone in terms of how it can be better in the games that matter most for Georgia a little bit later on this season, how the Kentucky game this Saturday can be a springboard for all of that. We'll try to do it next. I'm really glad you're with us. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Deemer Box, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Deemer Box. Go to deemerbox.com/DawgNation for $50 off while supplies last.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
There's kind of an interesting thing that I've noticed with college football fans, including the ones I'm lucky enough to get a chance to speak to every day here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Deemer Box, the UGA fans in particular, that after your team loses a game, there's a certain pocket of fans that kind of want to hear some criticism, whether it be national media, local guys, whatever else. There's a certain kind of fan who wants to hear the team taken to task for what went wrong. And no doubt I saw some of that on Twitter over the last 24, 48 hours. Even got some of those messages to my Twitter account, at DawgNation Daily on Twitter, where some UGA fans were saying, BA, you better give them hell this week. You better let them know what's wrong. You better tell it like it is. And obviously there's probably a responsibility to do that when you get a chance to speak into a microphone to as many people as I get to each and every day, and I get that. However, I also get the flip side of that coin, that some of those same fans that want to hear the criticism in the immediate aftermath of the game, tell the coach what he did wrong, tell the players how they have to get better, tell everybody kind of what the truth is about this situation. There is a moment in the week after the game where that feeling starts to subside a little bit, and you kind of remember this is still your favorite team, and it starts to get a little annoying when you hear so many people saying bad things about your favorite team, in this case UGA, and we may be coming up on that moment here this week for Georgia in the aftermath of one of the most inexplicable losses in recent Georgia history, certainly of the Kirby Smart era, getting beaten up along the line of scrimmage against South Carolina on Saturday. However, there is one more piece of criticism of Georgia that I want to play for you here, because I think this has some relevance, and I'm going to explain why, about the way in which that Georgia can use some of the statements like the one you're about to hear to hopefully act as a form of fuel to actually get better going forward. Dan Orlovsky, former UConn quarterback, I believe, was the color analyst for the broadcast this past Saturday, and was also on the ESPN program Get Up yesterday morning. They're kind of breaking down college football, and given the fact that Orlovsky had just seen Georgia, he was asked to give his assessment of UGA in comparison to the other so-called national elite, a group that at one time we thought Georgia was a part of and may still be a part of, but now, admittedly, we're not quite so sure. Orlovsky was asked to offer his assessment of Georgia, and Orlovsky, who had seen him in person, who had been between the hedges, did not pull any punches on this, ripping Georgia, calling him exposed, and then saying that maybe all of a sudden now, well, you can hear it for yourself. Here's Dan Orlovsky going in on Georgia after losing to South Carolina.
Georgia got exposed. But everyone keeps saying that Georgia was exposed up front physically. They weren't. Georgia was exposed on the perimeter. South Carolina just got up in their faces and played man-to-man coverage. And Georgia right now doesn't have anybody who can win against man-to-man coverage. And their coaches, I would argue, did not do anything to help their young players. And we often talk about blueprints when it comes to football. And so Florida now has the blueprint of, okay, against Georgia, get up in those receivers' faces and play man-to-man. Auburn, they're going to get up in those receivers' faces and play man-to-man. And there's not a simple solution. When you have guys that can't win against man-to-man coverage, there's not an easy solution. Georgia is not one of the 5 best teams in college football right now. I've seen Penn State, they're better. I've seen Ohio State, they're better. I've seen Wisconsin, they're better. I've seen Florida, they're better. Georgia's got a lot of concerns, and it's because of their perimeter.
So I think there are two really interesting issues to deal with Dan Orlovsky, who, as I said before, called the game for ESPN on Saturday, was on Get Up yesterday, kind of breaking down Georgia. The one thing is he says that the coaches didn't do anything to help Georgia. We'll get to that in a moment because obviously a lot of UGA fans still have a lot to say about that and a lot of opinions on that. Let me deal with the first part of this first, though. That Orlovsky says Georgia's biggest problem is on the perimeter, and they've got wide receivers who can't win man-to-man against man-to-man coverage. Can't win those one-on-one battles to move the chain, score points, and be the kind of dynamic offense required to keep pace with Alabama and LSU and Oklahoma and Ohio State. And you kind of know who the top teams in the country are, Clemson included here. You know who those teams are. You just heard a guy who saw Georgia in person go on ESPN and say, I've seen their wide receivers in a one-on-one, man-to-man battle. Those guys can't win. And if there was ever a moment that was the opposite of rat poison, if there was ever a moment that provided this group with maybe the extra fire, the extra motivation it needs, the fuel to go out and be better, what could be more perfectly worded than that as a way of kind of going out and proving the doubters and the naysayers wrong? And it really kind of reminds me of something from like way back in Georgia's past. The first time I got a chance to be in Georgia's locker room was in, I think it was October of 2004, when Georgia hosted then reigning national champion LSU, back when Nick Saban was still the coach for the Tigers. And LSU had beaten Georgia twice the year before, in the SEC championship included, kind of a blowout type game. And coming back, there was a rematch in Athens. Was at that time, the hottest atmosphere I'd ever seen in Sanford Stadium. Incredible atmosphere. Georgia won the game, actually blew out the defending national champions. One of the special days, I think, in kind of the modern era of Georgia football inside Sanford Stadium. Many of you remember the game. What I remember from the game, though, kind of as a wide-eyed young kid, getting a chance to be in that locker room after it was over, and the two wide receivers for Georgia that day, Fred Gibson, Reggie Brown, both guys had really big games. And one of the things that both guys said after the game is that Mark Richt, this is actually one of the great stories I've ever heard about Mark Richt, that Richt looked at both of them, Gibson and Brown, and said, and I'm probably paraphrasing, and maybe over the course of time I'm embellishing and exaggerating just a little bit, but I'm not doing it intentionally. This is my memory of what Gibson and Brown said. They said, Rick told us that the game plan rested on our shoulders, that because of the way that LSU sends pressure and because what LSU does with its first front seven, that we're going to have to go out here and win one-on-one battles against these very good LSU corners. You can look that up. They had guys that played in the NFL. They had very good secondary. But Rick told us, if we're going to win this game, you guys have got to go out there and win those one-on-one battles. And if you do, we'll be celebrating. And if you don't, it's not going to be pretty on Saturday afternoon. This game plan rests on your shoulders, and obviously the rest is history. Gibson and Brown went on and did that. I think it's really interesting to hear a guy that saw Georgia in person on Saturday kind of say out loud, I've seen the receivers and they can't do it. One-on-one battles, they can't run past people. Ball in the air, they can't go high point. They just can't do it. They're easy to guard, and a team that's easy to guard on the perimeter is then easy to shut down because you can stack the box and stop the run. There are a lot of people who believe that about Georgia right now. But in this world where even on Saturday, once again, Nick Saban kind of pushed back against the notion of rat poison and too many compliments, maybe there is something to be said for that you kind of want some doubters. You kind of want some critics. And Georgia's definitely got them now, and one position group in particular has it. The wide receivers and maybe Jake Fromm a bit as well in terms of what do you do when the rushing game is shut down. There are plenty of analysts right now who say you do nothing. That's what Georgia does. Georgia does nothing. It's incapable of doing anything. And I'm not quite so sure that some of that kind of stuff won't be reminded to receivers in practice. Won't be reminded to Jake Fromm in particular to say, is this really how you want to be thought of, or do you have some sort of response plan? And I tell you, as a fan of this team and also an observer of college football, I'm really curious to see how Georgia responds after having been challenged the way that it is by the media this week, given the way that it played against South Carolina. But there's also the other part of what Dan Orlovsky said there a moment ago, that in addition to receivers maybe not winning one-on-one battles, and some would add maybe Jake Fromm not delivering the football as well as he could, there's also the issue with what the coaching staff is doing to put the offense in the best position to succeed. And this is the kind of thing where a lot of Georgia fans feel very passionately about this at the moment, and media kind of knowing that took Kirby to task on that a bit yesterday, at least trying to get some more thoughts from him on, from Smart's perspective, what went wrong from the offense, and from Smart's perspective, what he and offensive coordinator James Coley can do to make things better. And here is an example of some of Kirby Smart's own assessment of his offensive failings against the Gamecocks. Here's Kirby.
Probably the toughest thing for us is, number one, turnovers. And in the SEC, do a study, 4-0 in turnover margin, you're not going to win, period. I mean, it doesn't happen. So let's start with that. Number two, lack of explosive plays, which we've struggled with a little bit. We're not getting explosive plays. Even our runs, we're getting runs, good runs, 10 yards or more. But we're not getting explosive runs, which are longer because there's a lot of people in the box. We're not getting explosive passes. We had a few, but not enough. So we did not win 2 minutes. You look at this year, what we've been great at. We didn't win 2 minutes before the half twice, all right, and then we didn't win 2 minutes at the end of the game. So there was 3 2 minutes in that game, which is very unique. We really didn't win any of the 3 of them, and that's one of our big goals is to win 2 minutes. Every game up until that, it seemed like we had either won defensively before the half or we had won offensively, and we didn't do that. So those are the 3 biggest things that we got to improve on, and we'll continue to work on them.
So one of the things that Kirby Smart brings up there, which I think is really important, I wrote about this in our forum at forum.dawgnation.com during the game on Saturday. Last year, Georgia was tied for 4th in America in running plays of 20 or more yards. This year, they barely cracked the top 40 in that regard. About halfway through the season, they're well off the pace they were setting a year ago. Now, what Kirby doesn't do there is prescribe some sort of solution to fix that, but hopefully privately behind the scenes, he and his offensive staff are hard at work to do just that. And once again, when it comes to another clip from Kirby, kind of disregarding something else that other people seem to think they see with their own eyes, my hope is the private conversation among Smart and his coaching staff very different than what he said publicly on the issue of what many of us think we've noticed of Georgia not throwing over the middle enough. Kirby said yesterday that he doesn't necessarily think that's the case. Here's Kirby again.
No, that's not the case at all. Jake's had some really good throws over the middle. Some of his best throws have been over the middle. I don't know where that comes from or where it would come from. There were some throws on the perimeter that weren't great throws. I mean, ones he'd like to have back, but it's not like he's not throwing it over the middle on that. Teams play us different ways. Some people play 2-man where they take away inside leverage. Some people just play man-to-man where they take outside leverage. He knows that. He sees it every day from us. So a lot of the routes are predicated by how people are playing us, but he's not throwing it to the inside or not throwing it to the outside based on ability to be comfortable.
So let me see if I can bottom line this discussion. I think Dan Orlovsky, the ESPN analyst who we heard from earlier, points to 2 key issues. How do the Georgia players respond to now being challenged? They can't win one-on-one battles. My guess is they'll buckle up, tape up, and come ready to fight. But how does Kirby Smart respond to having some of his play-calling decisions questioned, his overall offensive philosophy? He's under no real obligation to talk about that out loud. Yesterday, for the most part, he sidestepped opportunities to do that. But I would say he's under an obligation to fix what's broken, and for some Georgia fans, it feels like some of this stuff has been kind of broken for a little while now, and it's only now just kind of getting worse. How will Smart respond to all of this? That, for me, is a lot harder to make a guess or a strong prediction about. But as I said before, this Saturday against Kentucky, I'm very curious to see what the results will be. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by DeamerBox. It's great to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. As I said before, it's great to have DeamerBox a part of the program. And, of course, if you're watching on video, you can see the DeamerBox right here. This is like the ultimate tailgating apparatus. It's like a Pelican carrying case, which means it's virtually indestructible. You can put all your valuables in here. It's waterproof, which works out really well for days like today when the weather's not so great outside. If you're outside today, whether it be fishing, hunting, whatever else, tailgating on the weekends, this DeamerBox is going to protect all your valuables. And what's really cool is it's got a Bluetooth speaker in the front. This thing sounds great. If you have multiple DeamerBoxes, you can connect them together, and it just really becomes a great way to enjoy your tailgate even more. The battery life on this thing's up to 40 hours. The Bluetooth works from like 100 feet away. I've seen people put these in the river and just float down the river with them. Use them as a cooler. I mean, you can do just about anything you want to do with this DeamerBox. If you're the kind of person that loves being outdoors, the DeamerBox is the perfect apparatus for you to enjoy doing that. And by the way, there's a great offer on this for DawgNation Daily listeners and viewers. Let me give you a website to go to. You can go to DeamerBox.com/DawgNation. And when you get there and use the promo code DawgNation, all the way it's supposed to be, DAWG, we'll give you $50 off the first 100 orders, courtesy of our friends at DeamerBox. So it's DeamerBox.com/DawgNation for more on that. We're going to get Jeff Sintel here coming up in just a moment for our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. I'll tell you what. I'm gonna do DawgNation Invasion. I'm gonna do that in a little bit. Let me do some DeAndre Swift here for a moment before we get there, because as I said before, Kirby in some cases kind of sidestepped some issues yesterday. He was asked directly at one point in time if he supported the work that James Coley's done thus far this year. Kirby either didn't hear the question, didn't want to answer the question, whatever else, but kind of didn't necessarily answer that one head on. A couple other issues that Kirby didn't take head on necessarily, but someone who was pretty outspoken yesterday was Georgia running back DeAndre Swift. Our Connor Riley had a chance to catch up with him, and I thought Connor asked him a couple pretty interesting questions, including one of the things we talked about with John Stinchcomb, the fact that Georgia was rotating so many offensive linemen, and the offensive line in general just wasn't very effective on Saturday. What did Swift think about that? Here's a good question from our buddy Connor, and a pretty interesting answer from Swift.
As a running back, how hard was it to sort of deal with the rotating of offensive linemen? Does that really affect how you play and sort of approach the game?
I mean, it doesn't affect how I play. I think it affects them because we practice with a group of guys every week, every rep. So I think when I don't like to say a change of pace, but just some guys are more comfortable next to other guys. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an offensive lineman, so I can't really speak for them.
So DeAndre Swift saying that, yeah, he does think that lack of continuity might be affecting the offensive line. He kind of pulls it back between the banks before the clip is done, but pretty interesting to hear Swift be outspoken on that. Also on the issue of, as you're about to hear Connor ask, the lack of explosive running plays that I talked about before, or just sort of explosive plays in general. Also a pretty interesting, outspoken Swift in that regard, too. Here's Connor with Swift once again.
You got a lot of 4 or 5 yard runs, but this year you guys haven't really been breaking off those longer, 20, 25 yard runs. What do you think the reason for that is? Is it just more teams loading the box? Or
yeah, I think more teams loading the box, trying to take away the run and make Jake Fine beat us, and I think Jake's going to do that.
So, Swift kind of laying it out there in no uncertain terms. You should go to the DawgNation YouTube page. You can see the entire video with Swift where a lot of issues come up about, the 2-minute offense playing a little faster, coaches' decisions in a lot of regards. Swift, for the most part, didn't pull punches yesterday, which I think a lot of Georgia fans are going to like, and obviously one of Georgia's top offensive players, understandably frustrated by the way that his group played, himself maybe even included, against the Gamecocks on Saturday. So pretty interesting stuff. You can get more of that on our DawgNation YouTube page. But a good job by Connor Riley, Mike Griffith, who were with us there in Athens yesterday, for kind of getting some tough answers to some tough questions about what went wrong for Georgia against the Gamecocks and where they go from here. We'll hear more from Kirby Smart later on in terms of what he still thinks is out in front of Georgia, and a spoiler alert on that is he thinks it's still plenty. We'll do that. But for now, a bit more on UGA recruiting, including how the recruits themselves would have reacted to what happened on Saturday. Let's talk to Jeff Sintel as part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Time now for the Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update with Jeff Sintel. Here's part of DawgNation Daily presented by DeamerBox. And I guess, Jeff, if you don't mind, let me push pause on you just for 1 second, because I do want to make sure people are aware of something really fun right now. I've talked more yesterday about our situation with DawgNation Invasion, and obviously we're selling a ton of tickets to this. We sold a bunch more tickets yesterday. This is going to be an ultimate tailgate experience. I cannot wait to be a part of it with so many people who are going to be there. Cocktail party obviously looms in a couple of Saturdays, and everybody's getting ready for this. And one of the cool things about DawgNation Invasion of Jacksonville this year is a lot of you have said, when are we going to print more of those Gator Hater t-shirts? And we're going to offer those again. Well, the great news is for everyone who participates in DawgNation Invasion to Jacksonville this year, the first 150 anyway, a Gator Hater t-shirt's coming your way. So let me give you a couple of quick details on this, and then we'll get Jeff Sintel for our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. It's obviously the day of the game, November 2nd, from 11:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. Luxury tailgate experience, all-inclusive type deal, which includes food, beverage, entertainment. I'm going to be there. Connor Riley will be there. Jeff Sintel will be there. Mike Griffith will be there. Also, for the first 150 people who sign up to participate, a Gator Hater t-shirt is coming your way. For more information on this and to register to get your spots before they're gone, because they are selling fast, it's DawgNationInvasion.com for a whole lot more on that. With that said, let's turn our attention to our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. Let's get Jeff Sintel. There are a lot of kind of new twists and turns with the 2020 class I want to get to in a moment. Let me just kind of start overarching big picture here for a moment, Jeff. I know you've been talking to a lot of recruits over the last 24 to 48 hours. I'm sure you'll be writing about that coming up at DawgNation.com. But can you just give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of how recruits, whether they be dyed-in-the-wool UGA commits, supposed silent commits, targets, casually interested in Georgia. How does the recruiting world look on an upset loss the way that Georgia took one this past Saturday?
Well, Brandon, I guess by and large, good morning, everybody, and that's a great Gator Hater opportunity. I would say that, it's not as the sky is falling as most might would suggest, or even pearl clutching might be the other way to look at it, how Georgia stumbled over a South Carolina banana peel that was fueled by 4 turnovers worth of bacon grease. I would say most football players understand what it is as what it was. It was a 4-turnover loss. Some teams get upset sometimes, and I think it kind of is reciprocal, Brandon. And what I mean by that is much like a recruit doesn't expect them to be dropped by Georgia just because they have a bad game or their team performs poorly. That's kind of the same way we look on a place like Georgia. They still look at that as a cathedral to play a football game in front of a ravenous crowd with all the facilities and support and infrastructure they could imagine. They know that Georgia will be in the hunt, knocking on the door every year, and that's really just about all that any of these recruits can actually ask for.
Yeah, I mean, overarching, isn't it true that big losses probably don't hurt you, big wins don't necessarily help you in both cases as much as you might think? These recruits really are making individual, we kind of joke sometimes about business decisions, but they're individual business-minded decisions of how much playing time I'm going to get, how well do these coaches develop me, do I want to spend 3 or 4 years around these coaches and the players who are part of this program, that the ultimate recruiting decisions are a lot more situation specific than they are impacted by the emotion of, oh my gosh, so-and-so got a big win, I want to go there, or oh my gosh, so-and-so got a bad loss and I don't want to go there. It's really more about how the recruit's going to be treated by the coaches more so than anything else, or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, that's basically it, Brandon. The loss to South Carolina, the 4 turnovers, first of all, and there are some glimmers there, Brandon. First of all, recruits can look at that, especially on the offensive side of the offensive side of the ball, depending on how many times you rewatch that South Carolina game. What you have there is you have some recruits thinking, well, Georgia's opening it up more. They're not just running the ball over and over and over again. The 51 attempt says something to some folks, but then also if you're a defensive recruit, you have to like the fact how Georgia only gives up 20 points in an overtime game, a double overtime game, to an SEC team, and really only 13 of them can be bottom line to the defense out of the entire 20 points that Carolina scored. So that's still a very good positive for a defensive player there. And I think the way they look at everything in totality is Georgia losing a football game doesn't make them a better fit or a less fit for the defensive tackle room or the tight end room or the inside linebacker room or the cornerback position for Georgia. Doesn't do anything to change those relationships, the way they feel when they're on campus, the way they feel around the Georgia program compared to other programs. I think a loss can be treated as an abnormality. I think 2 or 3 losses would be something where people do start reevaluating whether they have a false positive about just how bright the future is for Georgia football. I think it's a wait-and-see mode, even in the most extreme cases there. Check in after loss 2 or loss 3 this season. And then that's when I think really true evaluation would start, because that would seem more than a blip on the radar. It would seem like a market correction for the program.
Shudder the thought of that, obviously. It's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. We'll talk to Jeff Sintel more about UGA recruiting. And, Jeff, let me be very candid for a moment that I know what I'm about to ask you is a question kind of born out of recency bias, and I know it's an overreaction based on one game. I sort of know that going into what I'm about to say. However, when I'm watching Georgia on Saturday, couldn't help but think, where's the speed? Like, where are the offensive guys running past people, creating separation? I mean, even some of the guys that I tout on this show all the time and still believe in as potentially future great players, they are not necessarily measurably fast. And so when I think about the 2020 class now, all of a sudden that feels like way more of a priority for me now on the basis of a game in which I thought that Georgia lost, and I thought a little bit extra speed could have helped there. So all of a sudden, admittedly, I'm probably a little bit more interested in a guy like Corey Wren than I would have been before. And all of a sudden, the Arian Smith situation where if Georgia loses him to Clemson or if Georgia loses him to Alabama, maybe I wasn't, all that engaged in that storyline one way or another. Well, now I feel a lot strong, a little bit more interested in that. Marcus Rosemy, I want to see some of those 40 times. I kind of want to see what his straight line speed looks like a bit more because, Jeff, Georgia's got some interesting playmakers, some guys that have some real good ball skills and a couple guys that can really high point it pretty well. Is there an element of speed missing, and how much do you think the 2020 class, whether the guys they've got in the fold or potential targets they could get like Smith, how much is Georgia set up to address that speed issue with its 2020 class?
Yeah, Brandon, well, when you follow the recruiting trail as closely as we do, one of the things you notice is you have early teaser trailers about where the roster, where the staff feels the roster has some deficits in. When Mecole Hardman goes to the league and ends up being a second-round pick, that validates something for the Georgia offense, especially when one harkens back and thinks about how Mecole Hardman seemed to have some of his best games against Alabama in championship-type environments, the national championship or the SEC championship. So you saw, Brandon, it was maybe March, April, where Georgia started getting in really thick, trying to recruit guys really heavy like Darian Smith and Corey Wren. And Corey Wren's the commitment, and speed always travels. Speed never goes in a slump, but what speed also does is it forces a wily guy like Will Muschamp to realize that that was he's going to be his game plan every time he plays Georgia. He's going to press the line of scrimmage. He's going to get physical with Georgia's receivers and make them beat man coverage, and then stick a dump truck, a hippopotamus, and then Terrence Cody in the box to try and figure out a way to stymie Georgia's run game, and that's what worked. And they had a 6'4" corner that was somebody that Georgia recruited a couple years ago. He came out as a safety, but he was a corner in T-Rob and Will Muschamp's defense. And Israel McGraw ends up being the National Walter Camp Player of the Year. He has 12 tackles. He has 3 interceptions. He has a pick 6. You see Georgia, sometimes on the recruiting trail, they show the hand about what they think the roster really needs or the class really needs, and that's to go get more speed, especially at the receiver position. And, Brendan, I think the way to look at that is it's not just one receiver like Corey Wren. That's 2 receivers because football is a very violent and physical game. And should an injury happen to one or two or one of those guys, and if Georgia does sign an Arian Smith, then Georgia needs to have more speed to bank on to go into a big matchup, because that's the thing that scares the coordinator more than anything, is a guy that can take the top off the defense, that can beat press coverage, that can get downfield, can extend, can separate. One of the things we're always hearing about Georgia's offense this year is you don't see a lot of this, you don't see the rub routes, you don't see a lot of that. Where are the slants? Where are the toss sweeps? I think another thing that's missing, and I think it's something that Jake Fromm has done very well throughout his career, is also the play-action game. And that play-action game is used to set up those deep shots downfield.
It's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. We've got more with Jeff Sintel coming up, including some stuff on Darnell Washington I think you're going to find to be pretty interesting. Before that, though, speaking of Marlowe's, let me remind you that this Thursday, it's the Marlowe's matchup live at the Marlowe's in Dunwoody. Myself and John Stinchcomb. By the way, Stinch was amazing yesterday with his breakdown of what went wrong for Georgia against South Carolina. More of the same this Thursday, 6 p.m., the Dunwoody location, 1317 Dunwoody Village Parkway. That's 1317 Dunwoody Village Parkway for our Marlowe's matchup. Myself, John Stinchcomb. We'll have the broadcast at 6 p.m. We'll have the Q&A after that. Really just hanging out and having a great time talking some Georgia football with you, including how this team turns it around and gets back on track for all the goals that we still think UGA can accomplish. We'll do all that this Thursday, 6 p.m. for our Marlowe's matchup, live at the Marlowe's in Dunwoody, 1317 Dunwoody Village Parkway. And, of course, fall weather being here, that means patio season for all the Marlowe's Taverns locations, including the one right there in your neighborhood there as well. So date night, business lunch, whatever, Marlowe's Tavern, just a really, really good choice. So, Jeff, I'm reading the forum at forum.DawgNation.com, and you had a pretty interesting tidbit on Darnell Washington, really in 2 regards. And on the one hand, you got the tweet from Washington where it sounds like he wouldn't mind taking a visit to Clemson. And, when it comes to visits, the Clemson visit's always the trickiest one because of, how they kind of go about their, recruiting situation there. But the other thing is according to what I read from you in the forum, that Washington's up to 290 pounds now. Now, listen, bodies change a lot from high school to college, and I'm sure that one way or another, Washington's body will change no matter where he ends up going to school. But in a weird way, Washington being at 290 is almost more concerning for me than the fact that he wants to take a visit to Clemson. I say this is someone who would obviously like for him to end up at UGA. So let me just kind of let you take this wherever you want to go. What do you make of Washington flirting with Clemson on Twitter and DJ Uiagalelei in particular? And what do you make of the fact that he's now at 290 pounds?
Yeah, Brandon, speaking of pearl clutching, that forced me to go look at the forum really quickly and make sure there wasn't a typo in that, because the number is 269, which is still a lot. He catches a lot of, I would say it's good-natured ribbing from fellow recruits about he's going to eat himself into being a offensive tackle. That's something that Theo Johnson kidded him about as well. But I think, Darnell Washington, first of all, I called that what I believe it truly to be, which is visit fishing, or at least maybe some doctoring of the trail or whatever. There's only one recruit that I think in the 2020 class that could start up a conversation or try to get a connection with staff members where he doesn't know the numbers and they don't know him and they're not already been texting for some time. Because that's what Darnell Washington did. Darnell Washington reached out on Twitter, of all things, to Brian Brzee, to DJ Uiagalelei, and basically said, have the coaches hit me up. And he dropped the all-in hashtag or whatever that he was wanting to check out Clemson. And I think that's what it is. It's visit fishing. He's thinking about taking a visit to Clemson to check out that program. Brandon, if you don't have a relationship with, especially a school like Clemson that goes through some very thorough vetting with their prospects, if you don't have a relationship with a school by October of your senior year, when that's your class cycles year, that's really not going to happen. About the only recruit that it would surprise me for a recruit to start up a recruiting conversation and a true relationship right now and end up going there would be a certain running back from the Lone Star State. That's about the only one that I would think that something weird like that could happen where somebody gets in October and ends up signing the kid. I think with Darnell, that's something where you look at it and you go, well, it appears to me that the official visits he still has left to take, like the one to Tennessee, the one he took on impromptu to Florida, it seems to me like he is reaching some measures of finality with his decision where he's trying to figure out, does he need to take official visits to all of his previous top 5 schools, the Alabamas, the Penn States, the Miamis, and so forth.
So that all makes all the sense in the world, but just to be clear, so it's more like 270 and not 290 then. 270 is still pretty big, though. Is that too big for Washington to tie in the stage of his recruitment?
I think so. I think he definitely needs to drop a little bit more weight. I think his ideal playing weight in college football, especially if he wants to be an explosive guy where a Georgia quarterback can target that guy way up high over the middle, especially over the middle of the field, which is so precarious for anyone to throw into these days and teams. I would think that Darnell Washington's best playing weight probably needs to be around 250, 255 for him to get some really good bursts on the off the line. And going back to the forum, it was 269, Brandon. So I guess when you read that, you hadn't had your 5th cup of coffee that morning and waking up from the South Carolina loss.
Yeah, maybe that's what that was. On a happier note here, something else that I saw on Twitter that I thought was kind of fun. I'm not surprised by this, but it's just kind of fun to notice. There's been a lot of Noah Sewell highlights as of late. Sewell's just a really good player and kind of a highlight machine because he's just throwing people around the state of Utah. It was nice to see Kendall Milton recently kind of shout out to him saying that he needed to be at UGA there. Milton doing what you'd expect, and on the social media platform, kind of cool to see him do it publicly. I love, a guy like Milton reaching out to recruit, and the fact that the West Coast guy, Milton, also talking to the other sort of Pacific-type guy, West Coast-type guy, at least living in Utah, Noah Sewell. You kind of like to see that if you're a Georgia fan, Jeff.
Yeah, well, Milton's actually putting in some business decision headline, social media viral highlights of his own. Really strong games he's had back-to-back since he's bounced back from a quad injury. But I think that the vapor trail of that was very interesting, of that social media exchange, because I don't know how many of our DawgNation Daily viewers and listeners can follow this, but there's a photo that was first tweeted out where there's a play on the boundary where a guy is kind of trying to go airborne to evade a tackle, and that's when Noah Sewell just comes flashing into the frame and basically helicopters him like Nat Moore in that longtime Miami Dolphin Monday Night Football highlight that just spans it seems immortal now because you still always see it, number 89 for the Dolphins. But so then what happens after that is Kendall notices it and pops an emoji, and then Noah responds with the actual tweet, the actual viral huddle clip of that play, and you see Noah flashing in, and basically it would be a good promo shoot for a Goodies headache powder or something like that back in the day, because he was bringing a headache for that young man when he entered the fray there. And then that's when Noah Sewell got the reply back from Kendall Milton that you need to be a dog for sure with stuff like that. That's one of those things there where I'm just going to, the thing to remember about is Georgia's defense didn't take too many L's for the way they played against South Carolina. That's still a very stout unit, and I dare say, Brandon, anybody that's picking the nit about the defense or, wants to bring it up, can the unit be even better with Trayvon Walker and then Tyson Campbell in there? I think that's about the only things people can look at besides the one time where South Carolina got past Devon Wilson and they beat Richie LeCounte in the corner as well with the safety help. But aside from that, that's still a very sporty, what I feel is at least an SEC championship caliber defense for Georgia. And defense will always travel. It's just getting that other side of the bit all lined up and fixed, which I think is the major worries for the whole Dog Nation right now.
Well, speaking of the other side of the ball and getting that fixed up, let's be like old times here for a moment for my final question. It's been a while since I've done this, although I guess I did do it on Friday, but we used to talk about Rick Gilbert all the time, then we didn't talk about Gilbert, and this Saturday, as you know, Jeff, is supposed to be Gilbert's official visit. So I guess let me just ask you if there's anything new you can tell us about Gilbert and kind of where things might stand. I mean, at this point in time, I don't expect Gilbert to come to Georgia. I don't know anyone who does, but it's at least an interesting opportunity for a visit chance here. So anything you want to tell us about Gilbert here as part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update?
Yeah, Gilbert is a great player. He's a tremendous player. I think if Gilbert may not be lost on many here, but I think if Gilbert was in Georgia right now, he would be a starting tight end, a starting performer in the rotation. The way he runs his route so crisply, the way he presents such a big target, a big matchup problem, it's somebody that the Georgia offense can certainly use right now. And let's face it, he is a more plug-and-play guy than both Darnell Washington and Theo Johnson look to be right now. I think his official visit to LSU last week, I believe, we have confirmed that Reed Gilbert and company will be in Athens this weekend for their official visit. Maybe this week might be the week where Georgia throws the ball around 40, 45, 50 times and ends up winning by 30, 40, 50 points. That would be that would be welcomed by that audience, no doubt. But he's a guy, but this is the time of year, Brandon, where there's going to be a lot of unrest, especially after the Georgia loss, because somehow a lot of Dog Nation feels that there's a chink in the armor, there's a chink in that perspective, like Georgia's the beast in the East and the baddest boy on the block, because and that's coupled with Noah Sewell taking an unofficial to Oregon. At the same time, Keely Ringo is taking his official visit to Oregon. He's plastered social media with some of the most viral snaps from that event. His mom was with him, his girlfriend was with him. There's a lot of plot threads coming here. Then you see successive weeks Theo Johnson taking trips to Michigan, taking trips to Penn State. He was again at Iowa last weekend. He also saw the Hawkeyes lose right there. Funny, I don't think he's going to have to field a lot of questions about how he feels about Iowa after them losing a football game. Just a different trajectory of each program here that he's considering. Gilbert remains a guy that's in state. Georgia has recruited him for the longest time. And everybody in Dog Nation, Brennan, and I'll gauge your thoughts on this. Everybody's fine, or at least can relent or deal with Eric Gilbert going to an Alabama, which it seems like where he's trending right now. Everyone can absorb that loss, but maybe not so much if Theo Johnson and Darnell Washington do not both show up in Athens. If you lose both of those, if you lose one of those, then all of a sudden that Eric Gilbert loss would sting a lot more. And Georgia has one more great last chance with an official visit to really get back in that thing with Eric Gilbert.
Well, if they don't get any of these tight ends to the class of 2020, Jeff, then they might as well just grow a patch of petunias right there in the middle of Sanford Stadium, because that's the only thing that grass is going to be used for.
10 and 20 personnel, that's what you'll see, man. You'll see a lot of running backs, and you'll see a lot of wide receivers.
Maybe
going
so.
Forward. Or they'll be converting those tackles like before and putting 42s and 48s on their jerseys for a lot of their heavy tight end jumbo sets.
Jeff, it's really good stuff. Thanks for being a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. We really appreciate that, and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow as part of Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, and I'll enjoy talking to you then.
All right, Brandon. Nice Tunas reference, by the way, sir. Everybody gobble up those Gator Hater shirts.
That's right.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Gobble up those Gator Hater T-shirts, indeed. A lot going on around Dog Nation. Marlowe's matchup this Thursday. Marlowe's in Dunwoody. Tickets on sale at DawgNationInvasion.com for our Dog Nation Invasion, which does include a Gator Hater T-shirt while supplies last. So a lot to keep up with and be thinking about. We've got our SEC Through coming up, including some interesting words from Kirk Herbstreit about UGA. I'll get to that here in a moment. But first, though, let me tell you about my friends at the UGA Alumni Association. And this is actually really cool. I have met so many people recently, being in and around Athens or in Knoxville a couple of weeks ago, kind of wherever else, that are actually really connected to the Alumni Association chapter where they live. Because for the most part, when you come to a UGA game or you go to a Tennessee game or you see Georgia play on the road, you're just going to see a lot of UGA fans who've kind of traveled in from other places. I even met a guy the other day that actually started the Alumni Association chapter there in the town where he lives now. And the one thing I keep hearing over and over again is the people who've connected with their UGA Alumni Association chapter or those who've started their own chapter where they live, honestly, you end up making some really good friends. Because if you think about it, the people that went to the same school you did, even if you don't know them from when you were in school, they have similar interests and certainly care about the dogs together. That's one of the reasons why you want to think about the UGA Alumni Association, connecting with it wherever you live, because there are 80 alumni chapters and more than 324,000 alumni who are kind of involved with all this kind of stuff. You can go to this website. It's alumni.uga.edu/chapters for more information. I know that's kind of a mouthful, so let me say that for you one more time. alumni.uga.edu/chapters. It's game watching parties, it's community service projects, it's a chance just to kind of develop a social network with the people that, as I said before, kind of in a similar walk of life, living somewhere but having went to the same school that you did, or having gone, whatever the proper grammar is on that, having gone to the same school you did. Check that out, alumni.uga.edu/chapters for a whole lot more on that. All right. So on his podcast this week, ESPN's Kirk Herbstreit has changed his mind. He now says that he thinks that Florida is the favorite to win the SEC East and not Georgia. Now, I know there's going to be a temptation among some Georgia fans to look at this and say, oh, what does Herbstreit know? He's a hater anyway. But it is fair to point out, honesty compels me to admit, that Kirk Herbstreit in recent years has been anything but a UGA hater. If you want to go back to last December, Herbstreit put himself out there for Georgia to be one of the 4 teams in the playoff after losing the SEC championship game, honestly more than I even did. Herbstreit was a big believer that if the playoff was going to take the 4 best, Georgia would be one of the teams that it took. Now, ultimately, I think Herbstreit deep down knew they would take, conference champions and whatnot. But he really put himself out there to say that he thought that Georgia was one of the 4 best teams in college football. So what's the old saying? Is it Walter Cronkite that if you lost Walter Cronkite, you've lost America? If you've lost Herbstreit here, if you're Georgia, you've lost one of your big proponents in the past. Now, I don't think that Herbstreit's right about this. I actually don't think that Florida's the favorite to win the SEC East. Yes, they played pretty well, at least all things being equal, and lost LSU. But the defense, for the most part, got torched in that game. Joe Burrow's moving the ball up and down the field. Georgia, I think, is going to shake this loss off. I don't know how much better it plays, but my guess is it won't play this bad ever again the rest of the year. We are all guilty of a little bit of recency bias from time to time. The last thing we saw is the only thing we can remember. Georgia is certainly responsible for the way that it played against the Gamecocks, but that's not the end-all, be-all story of who it is. So am I sure that Georgia wins the East, sure that it beats Florida, sure that it makes the SEC championship and then does a whole bunch of great stuff beyond that? I'm not sure of anything at the moment, but if you're saying who's the favorite to win the East, despite the fact that Georgia looked as bad as it did on Saturday, I actually still believe UGA is the favorite. Now, will it make good on those predictions? That remains to be seen. If you'll remember in the past here on the show, one of the things I've said before is is that Jeremy Pruitt is going to end up having a problem at Tennessee because he's not very good at using the media, that he's a little bit tense, he's a little bit almost nervous acting sometimes. He doesn't really know how to, because he's at Alabama, wasn't speaking to reporters on a regular basis, because he's got a little bit of an odd personality anyway, that he's just not good at using the media to his advantage. And when times get tough, and in Knoxville they have been tough, not having an ally in print media or radio or television, that might come back to bite him. Well, an example of the opposite of that, an example of, I think, Pruitt using the media pretty well. Now, this isn't a very big deal, but I think it matters a little bit. Pruitt in his weekly press conference yesterday, you may have seen this clip now, it's kind of gone somewhat viral, was asked about beating Alabama, and one of the things he says is, well, there's this high school team at Arkansas, and this is a true story. They onside kick every single time. They never punt. And he's basically joking and saying, maybe that's our recipe for beating Alabama, that if we just go for onside kicks every single time, if we just never punt, then maybe we can get through a game without ever giving the ball to Alabama. And if they don't have the football, they can't score, and maybe in that case they can't beat us. Now, when he says this, it doesn't get like the loudest laugh in the world, but it gets a little bit of a chuckle, which I think for Pruitt's kind of a step in the right direction. I mean, when you are like a 30-something point underdog against Alabama, there's only so much you can do. You might as well find a way to at least have a little bit of a self-deprecating sense of humor before the game. So for maybe the first time this year, and for possibly the only time in his Tennessee career, I actually think that Pruitt used the media pretty well yesterday. I mean, frankly, they got the win on Saturday against Mississippi State. That was a game they really, really needed. Expectations are as low as, sea level when it comes to the game against Alabama, so you might as well laugh about it, and Pruitt kind of accomplished that yesterday. I thought that was a pretty good job. Now, one more SEC through story, then we're going to get back to Kirby Smart and some of the stuff that he had to say yesterday. So noted SEC hater Danny Cannell is mad because in the AP poll, LSU has now leapfrogged Clemson. LSU number 2 in the AP poll, the other Tigers, now down to other 3. By the way, the other Death Valley there as well, kind of taking the L to LSU, who moves up to number 2. Now, I get Cannell's shtick. I'm a pro wrestling fan. I kind of understand the need to live your gimmick 24 hours a day, and I don't hate Cannell for that necessarily. Everybody's got a family to feed, and this is the way that Cannell's choosing to feed his family. But when it comes to LSU in particular, I've been arguing this for a while, that I like the idea of making the polls in season resume-driven and based on what you've done as of right now. From that standpoint, I believe if I had a vote today, I believe LSU would not just be my number 2 team. I believe it would be my number 1 team. The win at Texas still looks pretty good, despite the fact the Longhorns lost to Oklahoma this past Saturday. And even though they were playing in their own stadium this past weekend, LSU moving the ball against Florida the way they did, previously unbeaten Florida, who had just beaten Auburn, that's also kind of a resume-defining win as well. If you'll remember back during the offseason, my pick to win the SEC West was LSU. Now, admittedly, defensively, the Tigers haven't played as well yet as I would have imagined, but offensively, they are every bit as good as that prediction probably hoped they could have been. Obviously, Joe Brady, the passing game coordinator, has made a huge impact there. A little bit of maybe jealousy on the part of UGA fans to see how dynamic that passing offense is. They even ran the ball a bit better against Florida, too. So LSU at number 2, I've got no problem with that. They'd probably be my number 1 ranked team in America right now, and the idea that because they're playing in Bryant-Denny Stadium that Alabama is going to get what has been a rubber-stamped win against LSU this year like previous years, as Lee Corso would say, not so fast, my friend, when it comes to that. I think LSU is definitely a team to watch for now. We'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, let me get back to Kirby Smart here for a moment. Our buddy Tony Barnhart was there yesterday and asked Kirby, what's the message when it comes to the goals being still intact, the fact that you can still win the East, and if you win the East, you can still go to the SEC Championship, and if you go to the SEC Championship, no SEC champion's ever been left out of the college football playoff. Is that a message that needs to be delivered to your team, or does your team already know that? And here's what Kirby Smart said about that.
This is not first time we've had to deal with this. Each year we've had to deal with it at different times from different opponents, and they acknowledge that. They understand. Last 20 years or something of the SEC East, I don't think a team that's represented the SEC East has been undefeated. Maybe Florida, I think one year they did, but outside of that, it just doesn't happen very often. So what's more important is that our team gets ready for Kentucky and gets ready to go play than talking about the rest of the year, because we got to worry about Kentucky.
So I'm glad to hear Kirby Smart say that at the end. You got to worry about Kentucky, but what I would almost rather everyone sort of say, Smart included in this, and privately he probably feels this way, is is that to focus in on the fact that Georgia lost to South Carolina is, I think, kind of missing the point, believe it or not. One of my least favorite things in the world is results-oriented thinking. I like process-oriented thinking. And if Georgia had won against South Carolina by a point, playing the way that it did in the game, some fans' feelings might have been better. But the overall situation for Georgia, I'm not so sure would be better because clearly it seems to be following a flawed process with offense right now. So obviously Georgia's goals are intact. The loss doesn't necessarily change any of that. But the way in which Georgia played versus South Carolina does have the potential to make some of those goals unreachable unless the process is altered. And as I said before, Kirby's not necessarily under any obligation to kind of speak about the private interactions with him and his players, but the results on the field will kind of speak for themselves moving forward in terms of what kind of process are they following. So ultimately, the way Georgia played versus the Gamecocks is more of an issue than the fact that it suffered a loss. Losses can be overcome. But faulty offenses and flawed play calling, some of that kind of stuff is a little bit more difficult to leave in the rearview mirror. Before we wrap up here, let me also remind you about my friends at Kroger. A lot of you are always kind of worried about what to do when it comes to dinner time. Well, Kroger can take good care of you when it comes to stuff like that because you can do to Kroger.com/what's for dinner. My sheet almost went flying across the desk here. Kroger.com/what's for dinner, and they can take good care of you today. You can start planning meals, get a week's worth of meals. You get items put right there in your cart for delivery, and you can look for coupons too. So website, once again, Kroger.com/what's for dinner. All right, so speaking of the Florida Gators, DawgNationInvasion.com, the place to go to get a little bit more on that. And also, speaking of our Gator Hater Updater, we believe that game's still going to really matter. And feelings for Georgia by that point in time will be much better than they are right now. Georgia fans, I think, will be in a much better mood when you get there. And all these people saying Florida's the favorite in the East and, Georgia's doomed to fail. That may turn out to be true. Georgia didn't play very well this past Saturday. But there's also plenty of time. Game coming up on Saturday against Kentucky, a bye week after that for Georgia to be ready to keep defending this number we love so much. 1,081 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. No guarantee that number keeps climbing after the first Saturday in November, but you better believe that the Georgia Bulldogs will be ready. Try to make sure that indeed happens. Thanks for being with us as part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Deemer Box here today. Hope you all have a great day. I look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. And on video as a part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We appreciate you being with us, and we'll get ready to get your comments. First, though, let me remind you about my friends at R.S. Andrews, and you start to feel that little bit of crispness in the air, especially in the morning right now. It means a lot of you get ready to flip on that furnace for the very first time, and when you do, let's face it, that's an issue. When anything apparatus like that heats up your house also has to get hot to do what it needs to do, and that means safety comes into play here. And you want to make sure that your furnace is as safe as it needs to be to make it through the winter. That's why R.S. Andrews offers the furnace safety checkup for just $99. Give you the peace of mind you need to make it through the cold weather season, but you've got to go to rsandrews.com to get more information about that. All right, let's dive in here and get a lot of your comments. I started on YouTube yesterday, so let me do Facebook here for a moment, and we will kind of dive in here and get a lot of comments. And we got a pretty good little window of time to do these today, and then after that, we'll let you guys get on about your day and do what you need to do. So Miriam Martin Corbin says, always love my dogs, win or lose. I would agree with that. Cheyenne Taylor De La Garza says, if Fromm had another bad game, is he NFL bound or is he returning? What benefits more if more performances like this happen? Well, there's one thing to remember. NFL teams don't necessarily draft quarterbacks on the basis of how many games they won in college. Look at Daniel Jones starting for the Giants. I mean, first of all, his numbers at Duke were never particularly good. The record that he had with the Blue Devils also wasn't that great either. Look at the guy that starts for the Bills, Allen from Wyoming. I mean, his numbers weren't good, and his Cowboys team wasn't very good either. So there are a lot of quarterbacks that get drafted in the NFL, and some of them drafted pretty high, that didn't necessarily have great success in college. So I don't necessarily think Fromm will ever play as bad as he did on Saturday, but in a weird way, that kind of stuff doesn't impact NFL draft scouts as much as you might think. Obviously, they'd like to see him perform well, but NFL draft scouts kind of have their own way of looking at stuff. Robert Reynolds says, BA, hope you're having a good day. Thank you, I am. Just got out of a meeting and got some Krispy Kreme donuts. Today is a good day. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying that. Little donut, never a bad way to make yourself feel better after a loss for Georgia. Jason Green says to me, Jake Fromm is like a controller finesse pitcher in baseball. He has to win with accuracy and cannot make mistakes. Definitely does not have a game-changing arm, but rather a game-managing arm. If he's off or if we need explosive passing plays quickly, he's going to be a problem. Well, here's one thing I would say about the so-called typical game manager. We kind of all know what that is. I mean, sometimes one of the things that makes a game manager is the absence of accuracy. For the most part, one of the reasons why you try to protect your quarterback and keep him from throwing too much is because you're worried about where he will throw it. Now, on Saturday, 3 picks would lead you to believe that that Fromm was inaccurate. For the most part, the one throw is not so much inaccurate as was just a terrible decision to even throw it to begin with. The other two, maybe there were some mitigating factors in that one way or another. Either way, Fromm didn't play a great game. But when you think about typical game managers, you think about quarterbacks that can't put it into a spot, and that's not necessarily Fromm's case. Arm strength, obviously the issue. But ultimately, all you have to have is an arm that's strong enough. I mean, if you look at the guys in the NFL who have had the strongest arms, I don't know there's a huge correlation between winning and arm strength. I just don't know that there is. You have to have a strong enough arm to play, but beyond that, I don't know that there's extra credit for having an even stronger arm, but I understand the point. Justin Minton says Kirby needs quality control coach to help Kirby with late game decisions. It's kind of interesting. Smart said this a couple times this year, even yesterday for a little bit. He talks about the notion of analytics. Now, some of you care about the advanced stats, some of you don't. I do think it's interesting how much Smart says that they pay attention to analytics and how many analytics he says they have at their disposal, but there are a few things that Smart does in games that are like breaking the 10 commandments of analytics. Fade route type thing on 4th and short is an analytics no-no because that's the least efficient passing route you can throw. Georgia did that on Saturday, for instance. Punting the ball inside the 50 is like the thou shalt not kill of analytics 10 commandments. Georgia's done that a million times. Playing for field goals for the most part is a violation of the analytics 10 commandments. So Kirby has quality control people. Gosh knows he's got an army of people working for him, and he seems to have a lot of people, or at least presenting him with analytics data. He's either getting some of the wrong stats or he's not paying attention to what he gets to. Smart's a good coach, but he's not exactly what I think of as the most analytically minded coach. And in some cases, maybe there's some value to that, being more of a guy that goes with your gut. Maybe there is something to be said for that, but it's interesting to hear Smart use the word analytics as much as he does. Seems to know what people are talking about when they ask him about it. Certainly the havoc rate thing is an example of analytics that Georgia is using, but some of the other stuff is like as opposite of the sort of advanced stat, improving your winning likelihood. Some of the stuff that Smart does is about as opposite of that as you can get. Zenti Zelo Allen said, how do you feel about Kirby's plan to keep using 7 wide receivers? He's too stubborn to realize taking away targets from D-Rob and the other guys, Cager, Pickens, and Blaylock. I don't like it at all. Zenti, I said this during the show yesterday, that sometimes it almost looks like Georgia's coaching like it's the Under Armour All-American game, and you've got 50 players of equal value and equal worth, and so you just pick 11 and put them out on the field, and you let the chips fall where they may. But at this level, there is obviously, the stats bear this out, kind of equal distribution of targets, but not equal distribution of results. And at this point in time, halfway through the season, that's just kind of calcified. It is what it is. You've got some receivers who are contributing more than others are, and those are the guys that ought to be targeted. Now, as I said, this is more complicated than I make it sound, because there is certainly a chance that the absence of 20-plus yard runs, something I've been harping on now for days, there is a chance that that's caused by some of the receivers who are catching the ball not maybe being quite as good as blocking down the field. I don't know. I'm not watching the overhead video angle to be able to tell that. I don't know. But if we were to stipulate for a moment that's not true, and we're just basing this on what receivers, their primary job of catching the football, then there are a few Georgia players who catch the ball way better, way more likely to move the chain, and the average value of their receptions is just way higher. This stuff is easily found on the internet, and the results are staggering. So, Zenti, I think that's a really good question. Let me go to YouTube for a moment, and we'll get back over here and take more of your comments in just a bit on Facebook. On the YouTube side of things here, Josh Collins says, how can our young receivers get better if they only play every 6 snaps? Yeah, there's a lot of people who feel that way. There are a lot of people who feel that way, that you're not able to get into a rhythm. You're not able to get into that continuity of the game. Basketball players definitely feel that way. Sometimes I wonder if it's as true as they think it is, but that's definitely a pretty prevalent viewpoint now, that that you're just not able to establish that chemistry if it's on and off and on and off and on and off. A lot of athletes are going to tell you that. Jethro Smith says, BA, how do we move forward knowing that one of our most important aspects is flawed? We're struggling to move the ball deep, and there doesn't seem to be an answer. So, Jethro, I think that's a fair question. I try to answer this off the top of the program, that when it comes to receivers maybe not creating separation or Jake playing the way they did on Saturday, I'm hopeful the individual players in this regard just respond to the challenge to say, you think I can't create separation? You think I can't win one-on-one battles against defensive backs? Watch me. Put the ball in my hands, game on the line, let me go out and show you. We've seen athletes, Georgia athletes included, respond to that before. I think that's a simple thing for Georgia here, but I do think even beyond that, there are things that Georgia can do to make it more likely that these receivers and passing game succeeds. And, I've been saying it, and we've all been saying it. You've got to punish defenses for their propensity for wanting to stack the box, sell out to stop Georgia's run. You've got to punish defenses, much the same way an offense doesn't want to be one-dimensional. A defensive philosophy can't be one-dimensional either. Right now, defenses are getting away with being one-dimensional against Georgia, just showing up to do one thing really well, and Georgia's not necessarily making them be punished for that. So yeah, I think that's a fair question. There's another comment up here I wanted to get to. Somebody brought up kind of an interesting point. Let me see if I can find this. It was Rodrigo and analytics related. I don't see it now. Oh, gracious. Some of these are hard to find. A lot of comments coming in. But it's basically, the analytics would have told you that Rodrigo would have hit the field goal. Analytics probably tell you a little bit different thing when it comes to kickers overall, that perfection for college kickers is a standard that's way too high. I think analytics, for the most part, tell you not to play for field goals, that if you put the game in the field goal kicker's hands, even one as good as Rodrigo, who's legitimately a Groves Award finalist, that when you do that, anything can happen, or that just field goal kicking in general has a pretty strong regression back to the mean over time. It's kind of the corollary to, say, relief pitching in Major League Baseball, that over the course of the long haul, it's a lot more difficult to predict than people imagine. But maybe I'm wrong about that. 100,000 page views, which is a funny YouTube name. Our playoff dreams are done, LOL, next year, guys. And I'm sure that's probably tongue-in-cheek. I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. But as I tried to write about on Sunday, there are a lot of people who tell you that because other one-loss teams have done well, that Georgia is just all fine and well, including Georgia itself, shook off a loss in 2017 to make the college football playoff. It's not a given which of these two sides Georgia's going to fall on, because there are also plenty of top 10 ranked teams who got a loss and then got more losses after that. So I don't think anyone can accurately say how this is going to work out for Georgia. Do they belong more in the category of really good teams that shook off one loss and started playing better after that? Or do they belong in the category of previously highly rated, highly regarded teams who took a loss, showed themselves to be exposed, and then were punished by future teams because of that? It seems easy to either, based on how mad you are about Georgia or how optimistic you are about Georgia, to put Georgia in one category or the other. We don't have enough information right now to determine that with any certainty, one side or the other. Tram Dog says, BA, stop reading the trolls. I try to be equal opportunity here. Bubby Dean says, given the history of first-time head coaches and young coordinators, aren't we naive to be thinking the Dogs' time is now? That's an interesting question, Bubby, because I have definitely rethought some of the things that we talked about a lot during the offseason. And I had kind of bought into Kirby's notion that coordinators maybe don't matter as much. A lot of coaches said that. It wasn't just Kirby who said that. Pruitt was kind of saying the same thing while they were still waiting to hire an offensive coordinator. In retrospect, especially maybe on the offensive side of the ball, it seems that coordinators do matter. And your coordinator's ability to set you up for the most success probably does matter. So are we naive to assume that Georgia couldn't win with inexperienced coordinators? I'm not quite so sure about that. Coley's been a coordinator before. But was I naive in assuming that the coordinators in position at Georgia are maybe unimportant? Maybe I was a little naive in assuming that those coordinator changes wouldn't matter. I think that's a good question, Bubby. What else is going on? Daniel Love says, Fromm didn't even try and fall on the ball when he dropped the snap. I don't know about that. I mean, that all happened pretty quickly there. I'm not quite so sure about that. RT367 says, any injury update on Trayvon Walker? So we saw Walker on Saturday, had cast on his arm in a sling. Connor Riley will join us in a minute. He'll give us an update from what happened in Athens on that there yesterday. Tram Dog also mentions the notion of crossing routes. It opens up the run game by keeping linebackers from crashing in all game. Yeah, Tram, you watch NFL games on Sunday, especially when you get that overhead angle. I mean, you just see crossing routes all the time. I mean, that seems to be even, whether it be one of these sort of old school NFL play callers or kind of one of these new school Big 12 style play callers. I mean, everybody's just got crossing routes here and there. It's like spaghetti junction for almost every one of these NFL offensive plays, and it doesn't seem as Georgia has quite as much of that. I'm probably in over my skis even trying to talk about that, but to my own eyes, I notice a lot more of that with other offensive systems than I seem to notice with Georgia. I don't think you're wrong to bring that up. Chime Dog, and I'll get Connor after this, says, let me ask you, which was worse, Auburn in 17 or Saturday against South Carolina? For me, it's not even close. Auburn in 2017 was a very good team. Had Georgia not beaten Auburn in the SEC championship, that Auburn team would have been in the mix of the national championship. That was a very good team. LSU, by the end of last year, was also a really good team, too. So
3 losses.
Losing at LSU, that's a good team in one of the toughest stadiums in the country. Auburn in 2017, that's a good team, toughest state in the country. This South Carolina team with a half a season to go, plenty of football left, of what we know right now, this is not a good team. Based on who they've lost to, how they've lost, it's not a good team. For me, the South Carolina game is the worst loss that Kirby suffered since the end of the 2016 season, simply on the basis of how mediocre the team that beat you appears to be right now. Connor Riley joins us.
I still think the LSU performance is worse. It's one thing, if the ball bounces a few different ways, maybe Georgia wins that game. That LSU game was just an absolute butt whooping. And, sure, it's on the road at Tiger Stadium, but I don't think the venue of the game should make that a 20-point game. That game could have been played in Sanford Stadium if the two teams played the way they did that day. LSU still wins by quite a good margin.
Somebody mentioned the Trayvon Walker thing a moment ago. Any update on Trayvon yesterday?
Kirby said nothing about it on Saturday, said nothing about it on Monday. He was not spotted at practice yesterday.
So all we know is what we saw on Saturday, which he was walking in the cast. I say walking the cast was his arm. He was walking in the dog walk at the cast, had the sling. So that's all we know for right now. But any kind of cast is probably more than a 1-week deal, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a doctor, but that would seem to be true for me at least. Gary Holt says Coley brought Cager here to help because he already knew his playbook. It did not work. You're not going. He says it did not work. You're not going unless he changed the play calling. It is interesting to me on Saturday, and I don't want to let Coley off the hook on this too much, but I mean, when Cager was in the game, on the first second down play of the game, they did throw it to him, and they also threw it to him at least one point in time, kind of over the middle. The two things that we say we didn't see enough of from Georgia, second down throws and throws over the middle. When Cager was in the game early, they were doing that a little bit more. It's the weird thing about this box score from Saturday. For as much as everybody wants to say about Georgia being too conservative, too unimaginative, they threw the ball 23 times in the first half. That's before they were facing you got to move the chains to win the game scenario. They threw it, I guess, even more than that in the second half leading into overtime. But it's kind of funny. I would be very interested to see what the game plan and the overall spray chart for Fromm would have looked like had Cager stayed healthy, because there's a chance I'm wrong about this. It seems like they are willing to let Cager do some things they're not quite sure they want to do with other receivers.
And one thing I would just note on Cager, he left the Tennessee game with a shoulder injury. It looked like it was a shoulder injury again on Saturday. Also, ESPN reported that he had a rib issue during that game. It kind of sounds like these are the kind of injuries that linger and don't get healthy until you can have surgery and get them cleaned up after the season. So this might just be who Cager is for the rest of the season, a guy who's having issues with his shoulder every single week.
And Kirby did talk about his ribs yesterday
yes.
a little bit too. Yeah. Matt Talley says, does it look like our wide receivers run their routes and then just stop to anyone else? They just stand there covered instead of trying to move around to get open. I know you don't want to improvise too much, but when the play is already broken down, to try to get open and help the quarterback out. I think what Matt's referencing is, some of those overhead shots from Saturday, there was just no separation whatsoever. It's part of the reason why I was asking Jeff about the whole speed issue. And, I think that Robertson's one of your fastest players, and he was targeted 9 times on Saturday, so they're targeting him right now, but maybe design some plays to take advantage of that speed a little bit more, get Cook more involved. You see those overhead shots of that kind of spider cam type deal looking down on some of what Jake Fromm was saying. There was just nobody to throw to. And when you're getting the pass rush with as few guys as the Gamecocks were getting it with, in some cases 4, in some cases 5. But when you're doing that, as well as South Carolina was, you're able to drop all those guys back in coverage, and they were just running step for step. Big defensive backs. Jeff did a good job of mentioning that before. Tall guys, especially the guy that ended up with the 3 picks. But there was just nobody open on Saturday. Nobody open at all.
Yeah, it was a struggle. I think one of the big issues, Dominic Blaylock only had three targets in the entire game, and he caught those first 2, and the third one, he had a little bit of separation there. Jake just overthrew him a little bit. But I think going forward, that's a guy Georgia has to get more involved in the pass game. Both of his catches went for first downs, including one on that sort of game-tying drive that Georgia drove down there. And, as much as we, talk about like the idea of Tyler Simmons and Matt Landers, those guys just didn't get it done on Saturday. And you brought up the point earlier about, the blocking and whatnot. Georgia's not even getting to the point. They're not even consistently getting to that to that second level enough to where wide receiver blocking really is even making that much of an impact and potentially springing, a 15-yard gain into a 50-yard gain. That's just not happening. That wasn't happening on Saturday. And Kirby can say Georgia was running the ball efficiently. They had a season worst yards per carry average. It was not all around. It was just not a good day for the Georgia offense.
Stacy Goebel asking about Brian Herring. Sprained back was what it was called on Saturday for Herring. I think the back spasms was the word that Kirby may have used too. So, yeah, a back issue for Herring is what kept him out of the game, something that had been lingering at the end of last week. And he tried to go during warm-ups and just wasn't able to go. And that's the issue, and you can make a case that Georgia missed Harrion on Saturday. Caleb McCord says Coley doesn't need off the hook at all. The game plan was not very good. And, yeah, I mean, look, I've been doing this kind of thing virtually my entire adult life, talking sports into microphones, and the easiest thing in the world to do is criticize play calling after a loss, calling it unimaginative. That's the easiest thing to do. It's just every game that's lost in football, it feels like the play calling wasn't good. But in this case, though, I don't think it's out of bounds to say that Georgia's game plan was not a winning game plan based on the defense they saw from South Carolina. Doesn't mean that it can't get better. Coley in particular doesn't mean that he can't lead the charge towards helping it get better. But while it's instinctive to want to criticize play calling, that doesn't mean it's always wrong. In this case, I don't believe that it is.
It was a tough day all around for the offense. The offensive line, as John Stinchcomb really pointed out yesterday, really struggled, especially on the interior. Wide receivers weren't really getting open, and Jake Fromm had a terrible game. And, I'm not defending Coley here, but when that happens, when you get whipped up front, when your receivers don't win on the outside and your quarterback plays poorly, it doesn't really matter if it's Sean McVay is having a terrible time right now, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're Bill Walsh out there calling plays. It's gonna be hard if your players aren't out there and sort of winning those one-on-one matchups that they need to.
Justin Glaze asked about the dog walk on Saturday. Yeah, I'd love to have you come by and see us. We're pretty much always in the same spot. Kind of, if the players walking to the stadium, we're sort of on their right, kind of near the entrance to the Tate parking lot. That's pretty much where we always are. If it's it's a 6 o'clock game, it means 3:45 dog walk on Saturday. Is that what time the dog walk will be Saturday?
It will be at 3:45.
Yeah,
yes.
So we'll try to go in the air around 3:30 or so from right there. 3:30-ish, something along those lines. So I'm usually pretty easy to spot. You can always find Connor as well because he's got the camera with him. So, yeah, please come by and see us. We'd love to be able to see you there. Winston Mock says Jake has to be able to throw his guys open on occasion. I mean, what do you make of where things stand with Jake Fromm right now, Connor?
I think it was just a bad game. 2 of those interceptions pretty clearly weren't his fault. The Taylor Simmons one bounced right off of Simmons' hands. And from almost immediately after the interception where Landers ran the wrong route, he was pretty visibly upset leaving the field, and that was an indication that even before he had mentioned that it was a wrong route, that led me to believe that Landers probably wasn't where he was supposed to be. Fromm's had bad games before. He had him. This is sort of the first time he's played pretty poorly at home, but he's bounced back from those poor outings. He played well against Auburn and Oklahoma in 2017, and then last year after the LSU game, I thought he played an outstanding game against Florida. And he's a veteran. and I have no reason to doubt that he won't bounce back. And he's still the player that Georgia saw in the second half against Notre Dame and the sort of entire game against Tennessee, in my opinion.
Christopher Wilson says, is a win at Jordan-Hare still possible? So, Christopher, here's what my answer is going to frustrate you on. I think it's absolutely possible, but I think virtually everything other than, like, say, losing to Georgia Tech, I think virtually any outcome is possible for Georgia the rest of the season. I think winning every game, even actually looking pretty dominant before the year is done, I think that's still a possibility. I think losing more than once before the year is done, I believe that is also still a possibility. I think that what happened for me on Saturday was it doesn't change the ceiling for Georgia. It is as high as it ever has been. But the possible basement, the possible floor for Georgia, I do think it was lowered by what happened on Saturday. I would have told you going into the season, in fact, I did tell you over and over again, that I didn't think that Georgia could lose a game in the SEC East because of how much of a talent gap Georgia enjoyed over its division competition. Obviously, that's not true anymore. Georgia lost against South Carolina, which opens up some things now that I didn't think were possible during the season. Georgia could win them all. Georgia could win them all in decisive fashion. Georgia could lose more than once. And I know that's too wide of a range to be a definitive opinion, but my definitive opinion right now is there are a wide range of possibilities available to Georgia, whereas at the beginning of the year, I would have thought 12-0, maybe one loss if things really, really go bad. I wouldn't have even thought a 10-2 season was even mathematically possible. And now it is quite mathematically possible.
To answer the original question, if you remember how Bo Nix played against Florida 2 weeks ago, yeah, I'd say Georgia can definitely go in and win at Auburn. I said this to you before the show. I think Georgia has the best defense in the SEC right now. Sure, they're maybe not quite as disruptive as you might like on every sort of play, but I think to Muschamp and South Carolina's credit, they just said to Carrion Joyner, you're not going to do anything for us, but you're also not going to lose us the game. And Joyner, to his credit, did just that. And, sure, you would have liked to seen a few more havoc plays, interceptions, forced fumbles, turnovers, things of that nature. But I think this defense is going to be ready to play week in and week out. And even if they are a little banged up right now, especially on that defensive line, Jordan Davis has been battling an injury. Trayvon Walker is obviously hurt. I feel pretty confident that this defense is going to have Georgia in every single game it plays, at least through the regular season.
But you would agree that multiple losses before the season is done is on the table as a possibility.
Sure. It was in my opinion, it was on the table before the South Carolina game. So
you thought before the South Carolina game that Georgia might lose twice before the end of the regular season?
Yeah. It's football. You can cite recruiting stuff all you want, but there's a randomness to these kind of games. Every year in this sport, we see this. Ohio State had no business losing to Purdue last year. That's exactly what they went out and did. There's enough examples over time to where, especially at the college level, things can happen. I thought before the season, there's a really good chance. I said as much. They were going to lose at least one game in November, and they could possibly lose multiple, because when you have to play 4 straight really good opponents, as you say often, it's hard to play really well in back-to-back weeks, much less 4 weeks in a row. And so, yeah, you could have, 2 bad weeks out of 4 weeks, and that's 2 losses against what looks to be at least 3.5 quality opponents. I don't know about A&M at the moment, but still.
Phil Rogers brings a pretty good point. He says, BA, don't overlook Missouri at the moment. They may be hell by the time we play them. I do think that Missouri is a very interesting team right now because they still have Georgia and Florida to come. And when it comes to some of their home games as of late, they've been playing pretty well. They didn't cover against Ole Miss on Saturday. They still won by double digits. They beat up South Carolina pretty good, and they got a pick 6 to help them there in that regard as well. But the loss they suffered, in kind of odd fashion, going to Laramie, Wyoming, and losing to the Cowboys, they have seemingly shaken that off pretty well. And had the bad injury on defense. Maybe they've also kind of shaken that off a bit too. Missouri is an interesting team with both Georgia and Florida still looming. I don't think that, if I had to guess, I don't think Missouri wins either of those games, but they are that kind of team that kind of sort of flies very much under the radar right now, and the win against South Carolina, based on the fact that the Gamecocks beat Georgia, suddenly looks a little bit better.
I mean, yeah, Matt Rugavina brings up, before the season, Missouri's schedule is Charmin soft, and they're going to be able to rack up a lot of wins. The 2 SEC West teams they play this year are Ole Miss and Arkansas, who I think are the 2 worst teams in that division. and their schedule is backloaded. They play, I believe they play Georgia and Florida back to back in November, and so they're gonna probably enter that game against Georgia, I believe 8-1 or 7-1, depending on how many byes they've had to that point in the season. So yeah, that'll be a big game, but, I wonder if it's a little bit like that Kentucky game was a season ago where, on paper, wins and losses in rankings, that looks like a big game, but maybe the talent swings so heavily in Georgia's favor that might be, a little bit of a problem. Because would you say that Missouri right now, with the loss of Cale Garrett, has a better defense than South Carolina does?
I wouldn't imagine so. I thought South Carolina's defense looked pretty good.
And so to my point, I think you need to have a strong, capable defense, if you're going to be able to beat this Georgia team right now. And that, despite Barry Odom being a defensive coordinator, that has not been his calling card as a head coach. Missouri, when they win games, it's because they're scoring a lot of points.
Mike Toomer brings up something kind of interesting, and I've heard Arkansas fans say this. He says, our great wall right now, he means the Georgia offensive line, is starting to look like Arkansas offensive lines of the past. Now, this is one of those things where everything is sort of potentially subject to revisionist history after the fact. But it is kind of interesting to hear a couple of Arkansas fans come out of the woodworks. I've seen some of this on social media of some of the same kind of stuff went on in Arkansas, where big, seemingly talented Arkansas offensive lines, probably at least measurably less so than what Georgia's appears to be, maybe didn't have as much success as Hogs fans were hoping for. Maybe that's going on with Georgia right now. It is interesting, and I don't necessarily have a great answer for this, why the size of Georgia's offensive line, the seeming strength of Georgia's offensive line, isn't mattering more in some of these games than it is. Didn't matter as much as I hoped it would have against Notre Dame, for instance, a game that Georgia won, and definitely did not matter as much as I hoped it would on Saturday in a game that Georgia lost versus the Gamecocks. I still wouldn't trade Pittman for anyone, and as a fan, I don't believe I'd trade this offensive line for any other offensive line. But it is true, and maybe all of this is just injury-related, right? Maybe it's just as simple as that. But it is true that that group is not making the impact during the season that I hoped it would. Statistically, the numbers actually look pretty good for the Georgia offensive line. As Connor said, there are more 4-yard runs right now than there are like 10-yard runs. So, I mean, a lot of the yards that Georgia's getting in the running game are so-called line yards. But in terms of just your own eye test type of thing, moving guys off the ball, certainly against a very good South Carolina defensive line on Saturday, there's no other way to say it. You're not getting what you hoped you would have gotten from the Georgia offensive line right now.
When you get whipped inside like Trey Hill, and whoever was playing at guards like Georgia did against Javon Kinlaw, it's hard to win. It's if you want to, there's a reason why when teams beat the New England Patriots and Tom Brady, it's because they're able to rush with 4 and win at the line of scrimmage. And if Georgia, Trey Hill did not play well. Trey Hill had a pretty tough game, both from a blocking perspective, and I actually think his struggles as a blocker in that game started affecting his snapping ability there. He had a couple of low snaps in that game. And, I mean, Javon Kinlaw, there's a real good chance that he's the best player, the best defensive lineman Georgia will face this year. And before you mentioned Derek Brown, I'm well aware of how good he is. I'm saying that's how good Kinlaw is. The reality is, Georgia's interior, Thomas and Wilson are great, but when you're getting beat inside like Georgia did against South Carolina, it's just going to make everything on offense much, much more difficult. Because on the pick six that Jake Fromm ended up throwing, there was pressure that came right up the middle, and that's sort of, I think a big reason why Fromm was forced to roll out and make the decision that he did.
Let me get a few more comments here. We'll kind of do this rapid fire, then get off the air. Mike Gay says, watching the game a second time, our receivers hurt us worse than the offensive line did. It kind of ties into something Kirby Smart said yesterday, not necessarily blaming one group more than the other, but on the 3 sacks that Georgia allowed. He says that 2 of those were coverage sacks and not offensive line sacks. So I think you're probably right about that overall. Kathy Aquavy Green says Hot Rod's our number 1 point producer right now by a lot. And Kathy, I think that's a good point too. And no one's going to turn their back on Blankenship here. He'll still be a huge fan favorite. And he's still an important part of the Georgia equation. I think perfection is just too high of a standard to hold any kicker to. It's one of the reasons why I believe that you shouldn't try to play for field goals. That if you put yourself in a situation where you need a field goal to bail you out in regulation or bail you out in overtime, something's gone wrong to even lead up to that. And maybe at times Kirby has been a little guilty of playing for field goals a little too much because the assumption is you've got a perfect kicker, and that in and of itself is a mistake. But the ovation that Rodrigo gets before the game on Saturday is just going to be as loud as it ever was. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Matt Bryant, I believe, coming into this weekend was the second or third most accurate extra point kicker since they had moved that back in 2015. Unfortunately, in life, sometimes guys just miss.
Yeah, I mean, Bryant's the Falcons kicker who caused the Falcons to.
Well, he didn't cause the Falcons. He wasn't out there playing defense, giving up 34 points to a rookie quarterback and head coach.
No, I'm just telling people who Bryant is for the people who may not have followed the game. Nick Lurch says the problem now is there's doubt in our minds where before Saturday there was very little. Now our dogs have to come back and show us they have the team we thought they had and still think we have. It's going to be tough, but we all knew it was going to be a tough second half of the season anyway. Let's just go to work and remember we are dog fans. I think that's a pretty good message from Nick to other UGA fans. I think the other thing, too, is I'll let you go back and check out some of the things John Stinchcomb said yesterday, because one of the things I asked him was, when you're a Georgia player, it's great to be, a dog most days. You get everybody in the world telling you how great you are. But for a couple days after a loss, especially one that Georgia kind of suffered against South Carolina, for a couple days maybe staying off social media is a good thing, because let's face it, some UGA fans take this kind of stuff too far. So-called fans take this kind of stuff, too far, and just in general, you're not getting quite as many pats on the back as you typically got. So while the fans will no doubt continue to support the team and move on from the loss, kind of shake it off, there is an element of the team itself that has to circle the wagons now and say, hey, this is about playing for each other. This is about what we share together. This is about trusting the guy that's blocking for you or throwing to you or that's going to be catching the ball. This is about all of that kind of stuff. And so blocking all of this out, fans included, is actually probably a necessity for Georgia right now. In some cases, the happy times, you feed off the fans. You feed off the energy in the stadium. Some of y'all were there on Saturday. There was no energy in that stadium. There was nothing to feed off of. Players and coaches are forced to feed off each other in moments like this. And against Kentucky, even though it's a night game and the twinkly lights will look pretty, that's probably still true here as well, that this is going to have to be a group that goes behind closed doors and, does this for each other, because at least for a little bit, you're not going to get quite as much fan energy as you're used to feeding off of.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think energy is going to be an issue with Georgia this Saturday, at least from the player and team perspective. I don't know about the fans.
Oh, I didn't say that it was going to be an issue. I'm saying that the issue is generated internally now in a way that it's not typically. Christopher Wilson says, "BA, my only concern is getting a W in Jordan-Hare. What are your thoughts?" Well, as I said earlier, Christopher, we addressed your comment. I think this is still a game that Georgia can win. I always thought it was Georgia's toughest regular season game, and given the issues that have come to bear against South Carolina compared to what also plagued Georgia the last time it went to Jordan-Hare, I think that's a really tough game. If I had to predict, I guess I'm still predicting a Georgia win, but do I feel as confident about that as I would have even 14 days ago? No, I probably don't. I definitely think there's a wait-and-see mentality that we all ought to adopt for not just the toughest games on Georgia's schedule, but really any of those games for right now. A couple quick points, and then we are going to go. Jesse Carmichael says Auburn's not going to score any points unless it's on an offensive turnover. Yeah, that's obviously a team that's got some offensive issues right now. They've got a pretty significant injury to its running back, Boobie Whitlow. We're going to see what his status is as you get closer to the Auburn game for Georgia coming up in a few weeks. Robert Clark on YouTube says, regardless of what happens, Kirby needs to take a long look at his offense this offseason. Yeah, I wonder. I wonder how that goes, because obviously we got a whole half of a season's worth of data to still collect, and maybe Kirby, who we assume is steadfast in his belief and his philosophy, maybe by the time this season's done, he'll get the last laugh on his critics on some of this kind of stuff. One way or another, though, my assumption is that even if Georgia starts winning games again, that this conversation will carry over into the offseason just a bit. And it has always been my curiosity if Georgia might eventually have to outsource some of this offensive stuff, and maybe that's a conversation that's coming. RB says Kirby's going to take the field goal every time they get inside range, not worried about getting 7, except when the game's on the line, he tries to go for it. So, yeah, listen, I have said pretty consistently for the last couple of years that one of the things about Kirby's coaching philosophy I wish was different is I just wish he was more aggressive in general, going for it on fourth down instead of punting, pushing hard for touchdowns instead of field goals. I feel like just in general, Kirby Smart has coached in kind of a conservative manner when it comes to that kind of stuff. And if I could change one thing about him, that's the thing that I would change. And that's got nothing to do with Rodrigo missing on Saturday. Field goal kickers will eventually all miss. It's just a fact. There is no such thing as a perfect kicker. It's great to have a very good kicker. It's awesome to have the best. Georgia might have the best, but there's no sure thing when it comes to field goals. And when you're a team, especially playing as a 3-touchdown favorite, the only sure thing is if you don't play aggressively 4 touchdowns, you are making it more difficult on yourself to win. Tram Dog says, if we score 35 on any opponent, I believe we win that game. Our defense is that stingy. Tram, I think stingy is a great word to use for the Georgia defense right now. There's no doubt that it's not yielding a ton of yards and it's not yielding a ton of points, and that will give Georgia a chance to win every game. I think that's well said. GB2 says, BA, if we could keep one receiver from 2018, who does this team need? Holloman for sure for the hands or McCole for the speed? Yeah, I thought that Connor made a pretty good point in the post-game show on Saturday about this team because Holloman did both things well. Caught the ball well, was also a really good blocker, that you could certainly say that Georgia's missing him right now. But based on the feeling of what you have left over from Saturday, what seemed to be a lack of speed, boy, it's difficult not to say Hardman there on that as well. So in the moment, I believe I'm going to say Hardman. You ask me again in a couple of weeks, maybe I'll say Holloman. Connor, you got a thought on that?
I think it's got to be Holloman, especially just given how important Lawrence Cager has kind of been to this Georgia offense. I think, having another guy like him, especially now that Cager is out, I think would have really helped Georgia's offense and sort of what they'd be able to do.
Let's see if we're going to do one or two more things before we get out of here. That's a good question, though, GB2. I appreciate you asking that. Jermaine Jones says, honestly, I have said that I put this on Kirby mostly, that we should ride with the cards that we have and not worry about the ones we don't. Fair enough. Here's one thing I'll say about Kirby. I know there's some frustration with him. The one thing that I don't think Kirby's going to do, nor do I think he's under much obligation to do, is necessarily show his hands to media person, fan, anybody else about the changes that he plans to make. There are some changes that he might be making philosophically over the next couple of games. We might not even notice so much unless we're watching really, really closely. But in terms of doing a Monday press conference, it's nothing but a big mea culpa and a post-game press conference where you just sort of fall on the sword. That's not necessarily Kirby's job. Does Kirby need to change? Probably so in some regards. Are there some philosophical changes that are needed? I think most of would say probably so. Is it Kirby's job to sort of illustrate exactly how that's going to change and how that's going to be different? I don't know that I necessarily feel that way. So I didn't necessarily hear what I wanted to hear from Kirby yesterday, but I don't know that it's his job necessarily to go out and say all that. It's just his job to fix what's broken, and the results over the course of the next half season will kind of tell us that one way or another.
I did find it interesting that, he was asked straight up to evaluate James Coley to this point in the season, and he completely non-answered and ducked the question there.
Yeah, and, I don't know what to make of that. Obviously, there's one way to read into that to say, well, Kirby didn't want to answer the question because he didn't want to be seen as showing support for Coley, and that might be true. And there's the other part of this of Kirby doesn't even want to validate the question because he doesn't want to give any help whatsoever in creating some kind of narrative, and that might also be true there as well. I guess from Kirby's perspective, if you don't answer the question, you create a void that's going to be filled with other people's speculation. And when you don't speak specifically to the offensive issues, you also create a void that can be filled by your players. My guess is DeAndre Swift, as outspoken as he was yesterday, probably was not Georgia's favorite thing on that. But there were some things about Saturday's performance that were probably, certainly needed to be spoken to. And when Kirby chooses to decide some of that kind of stuff, it's not a surprise that a player maybe steps up and speaks there in that regard. So it's kind of an interesting situation for Georgia right now where it's difficult to control this messaging. Kirby loves control, but this is a difficult message to control right now because it's sort of hard to explain away what people are seeing with their own eyes.
I get what he's doing. I just, I think it's okay, and I don't think, this isn't just a Georgia or a football player problem. This is, I think, a societal problem. Sometimes it's okay and important to be honest with how you feel in sort of saying things out there. I thought Swift was very honest and candid yesterday, and, some people might not like that and the attention that it brings to it, but sometimes this stuff needs to be said. Like when a problem is going on, you're just, gonna say that it's not call a spade, I don't think that helps anything.
certainly that's what needs to be what needs to happen privately. I think you can debate if it needs to happen publicly as well. If there's any benefit to that publicly, but privately, which kind of go back to the point I was making a little bit earlier, is I'm definitely sure there were some very candid meetings and some conversations, and maybe some players spoke up privately, even towards coaches in a way they have not before. We know that happened at the end of the 2016 season when Chubb and Michelle went to Jim Chaney's office and said some things. You wonder if maybe a player felt emboldened enough to do that after this game against South Carolina as well, or maybe more guys stepping up and speaking to other players on the team in a way that had not been done before. As we get ready to wrap up, Kathy Aquavia Green and some others have kind of pointed out, I guess we had a little bit of a spam issue on Facebook today. We will take a look at that and see if we can get that cleaned up for next time. Yeah, boy, a couple of those popping in there. Y'all, thanks for pointing that out. And by spam, I don't mean bad comments. I mean like legitimate spam. So we will take a look at that and see if we can do something about that. We appreciate you bringing that to all of our attention. Also, I'll tell you on the way out the door here, make sure you check out ajc.com to get your Atlanta news now. Really interesting coverage continuing of the ever-growing senior care facilities and the booming business that is in Georgia, and kind of what's going on behind the scenes on some of that kind of stuff. AJC.com doing a great job of providing more details on that. Also, plenty of sports stuff too. Braves offseason getting rolling on, heading towards a hot stove. Preview of that. Falcons in the aftermath of their loss to the Cardinals, and kind of what happens from there as they have a interesting stretch of home games coming up, and Dan Quinn's fate kind of hangs in the balance. Plus, Hawks getting ready to start their season. Just all kinds of really fun stuff. AJC.com. You can get your Atlanta news now at AJC.com. Also, huge thanks to R.S. Andrews for bringing the R.S. Andrews cool down to you. Air, heating, plumbing, electric. You know, R.S. Andrews can play all those positions for us. And this time of year, you start thinking about the heating stuff. The furnaces are going to be coming on pretty soon. You can get that $99 furnace safety check with our friends at R.S. Andrews. You can find them online at rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day. See you back here tomorrow, not just for our R.S. Andrews cool down, but also Dog Nation Daily presented by DeamerBox. We'll look forward to speaking to you then.